Today we're moving on to our next video, which is the impact of the Republican government on 1920s America and the Republican policies that they'd follow and the effect this will have on specifically the economy of the US throughout the 1920s. To start with, I thought we'd put the election results for 1920. Now, as you can see from this, there was a small area that the Democrats managed to win. But in terms of the popular vote and the electoral vote, I think it's clear to see that America's gone back to a very Republican viewpoint. 1917, the American people were changing their ideas about sort of staying out of the war, and they got involved in that. But before then, America had wanted to remain isolated from the United States, and I think you can see from this that basically by this point in 1920, Harding's come in on the promise of a return to normalcy, and I think it's clear that that's what America wanted. Since the 1850s, 1860s, it's one of the biggest margins ever seen in a popular vote, 60% to 34%. It shows how popular Harding was. And today we're going to talk through each of these individuals. To start with, Warren Harding. He was president from 1921 to 1923, and he was actually quite a surprising choice as a Republican candidate. And this is because, well, it's made even more surprising from the fact that he wins this landslide election, this landslide victory. It remains the largest victory, popular vote percentage margin of 60% to 34% in any election after the year 1820. Harding, as a man, was raised on a small town, or in a small town in Ohio, and as a young man, he went into the newspaper industry, and he brought back an almost bankrupt newspaper from failure. He then served 2 terms on the Ohio State Senate before becoming senator for Ohio in 1914. Whilst he was there, he was famous for missing more sessions than he actually attended, including key debates on prohibition and women's suffrage. In the election campaign of 1920, Harding called for a return to normalcy, or a return to 19th century government, or 19th century with little government intervention at home and in foreign affairs. Harding said, "We want less government business and more government in business," which sort of reflected that idea as well. He has several achievements as president, though. He made several cuts to government spending, from 5,000 million in 1920 to 3,330 million by 1922. And that's for the role of the federal government with that bit. He also tried to make the government more efficient. For example, he added Congress. So he addressed Congress on several occasions, calling for an increased federal government role on the economic and social life of the nation. And also, it's important to note that his belief in federal government, or this idea of a limited involvement from the government, reflected the popular mood of the nation at the time. Harding did ultimately restore normalcy. However, he's also described as one of the weakest and least effective presidents because of his beliefs that his role should actually be very minimal. He achieved very little due to this belief in normalcy and a return to this very limited federal government role as a result. Harding also made some dubious appointments as president, and from his early in life as well, he was known to basically promote his friends, what was sometimes called the Ohio Gang, cronies. Then they were men who had worked with him on a state level, but were granted national responsibility as a result with working with him. In 1923, it emerged that he had been involved in extensive corruption during his administration. An example of this was the head of the Veterans Bureau had misappropriated or wasted $250 million, and other organizations had accepted bribes whilst he'd been president. The most famous of these was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. This was when the federal government leased land, which they knew to have oil on it, to private companies. And then basically the people that Harding knew made $400,000 between them, 2 men known as Sinclair and Fall. It was eventually discovered, and Fall became the first ever cabinet member to go to prison for something that happened whilst he was in office. Our next president then in the middle is Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 1928. He replaced Harding, who died from a heart attack in 1923. So he was actually the vice president. He wasn't actually brought in himself, or he didn't stand for election directly. In the presidential election campaign the following year, Coolidge won a decisive victory. He was given credit for a booming economy at home and the isolationist policy abroad, which had begun under Harding and continued under Coolidge in his first year as president. Coolidge was a qualified lawyer in 1891, and 9 years after that, he became the Republican town mayor of Northampton in Vermont. His rise in politics continued as he was elected governor of Massachusetts in 1919, and then in 1921, he became vice president to Harding after serving as his running mate in the previous year's presidential election campaign. When Harding died in 1923, Coolidge took his place as president, but only stood for one term. Coolidge liked to be thought of as a man of the people, especially those living in small-town America. He had very 19th century views, believing in as little government intervention as possible. The business of America is business, he said. Although criticised for doing and saying very little during his term in office, he made many speeches and met more people than any of his predecessors. Coolidge enjoyed being seen in public and was a popular president because he exuded confidence and appeared calm and unflappable. He was honest and incorruptible, unlike other presidents, and did not smoke, drink, or chase women. He was seen as the dependable pilot at the helm of the American ship. His election victory in 1924 led to an extension of Republican pro-business policies, with low taxation, low interest rates, and minimum government spending. This said, Coolidge has been criticised for his low work rate. He's famous for sleeping a lot, and so much so that he was actually nicknamed Silent Cow because of how little that he did. Some believe that he suffered from depression from about 1924 after the death of his son. To some, he had a superiority complex, and although he acknowledged the problems the US had, he's famous for doing very little to actually address these issues. As president, he was determined to do less rather than more than any of his predecessors. And then, as we mentioned earlier on, Coolidge refused to stand as president in 1928 due to health concerns. And then our final president, we'll mention him very, very briefly because he is president during the last part of the boom of the 1920s. But more notably, Hoover is quite wrongly dubbed the do-nothing president for the Great Depression from 1929 to 1932. But Herbert Hoover was born to a Quaker family in a small town of West Branch, Iowa. He went to Stanford University as a mining engineer, and he set up a very successful mining business. In 1917, when the First World War began, as far as America was concerned, he was appointed National Food Commissioner, and 3 years later became Secretary of Commerce in Warren Harding's government. By 1928, he won the presidential election, but 4 years later, he had lost to Franklin Roosevelt in the 1932 election. Hoover was a very shy individual who often shunned publicity. He was a man of administration rather than sort of being in the spotlight. But his presidency, like we said, was dominated by the Great Depression. And in that time, as a little aside, Hoover worked tirelessly to try and actually combat this. Usually very long hours and days. But as the Depression got worse, he was, I believe, quite wrongly blamed for quite a lot of this. And he gets an unfair reputation as an uncaring president. And that is the presidents of the United States. It's worth saying at this point as well that they have 3 core beliefs that I think it's worth making sure that you're aware of as well. These are the ideas of low taxation, where the government believes that if you're taxed less money, you'll have more money to spend, so you'll spend that on more luxury goods, consumer goods that were around in the 1920s. And then these next 2 sort of tie together really, but this idea that it's the role of the federal government to do very little, laissez-faire, which is a French term for leave well alone, and also this belief in rugged individualism, which is that if you try and help people, you'll make them weaker and you'll make them more dependent on the state, and that it's actually the job of the American government to just allow people to get on with life. And then finally, high protective tariffs were designed so that you could basically, it would protect American imports by protect American products by charging people for anything that's brought in overseas, and that means that people are going to be more likely to buy American goods. So just to talk through those policies then just there. So laissez-faire business. Coolidge actually helped with the views of many in America in this time, and it's this belief that the government should do as little as possible in the day-to-day running of the economy. If businessmen were left alone to make for their profits and their own decisions, it was thought that high profits, more jobs and good wages would be the result. This was the policy of laissez-faire. The only role for the government was to help business when asked to do so. Under Harding and Coolidge, the Republican economic policy of laissez-faire contributed to the prosperity of the USA. Low taxes and few regulations meant that businessmen were able to chase profits without fear of interference. Laws concerning price fixing were often ignored. Rugged individualism. Successive Republican presidents believed in rugged individualism. This was a term used by Republican presidents such as Hoover, who believed that people achieved success by their own hard work. It originated with the early Americans who moved to the West and made a new life for themselves on their own efforts. And then finally is this idea about protectionism, where basically the Republican governments put tariffs on imported goods in order to limit the competition from foreign imports. Imports became more expensive compared with American-made goods. This, in turn, encouraged the purchase of American goods and helps US-based trade. The Ford-Niebuhr tariff in 1922 raised import duties on goods coming into the USA to the highest level ever. And in this way, it protected American industry and encouraged Americans to buy more home-produced goods. In addition, a reduction of income tax rates left some people with more cash to spend on consumer goods. And that just sums up the Republican presidents and their policies in the 1920s. In the next episode of this, we're going to look at the reasons for the economic boom in the 1920s.